So I've been set these titles, a bit like essay titles for something that I'm not sure who set them. I think it was Satyadasa. And I just sort of, I got a WhatsApp message with these 3 titles. I thought, okay. And later I looked at them and began to think about what I could say. And I do notice they do fall roughly under Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. So tonight the theme is the Buddha, which I hope all of you realise is one of the 3 jewels of Buddhism we have on our cases. In fact, it's the yellow jewel, the gold jewel, the Buddha jewel. So how to imagine a Buddha? It's interesting that the question is put. It's immediately a little difficult for me to say, because the Buddha has been alive in my imagination for the great majority of my life. Since I was about 20, that's when the Buddha came into my life, and he's a living part of my experience now, umpty-tum years later. I'm not going to tell you exactly how many. You've got to have some secrets. More than 50 anyway. And thinking about it, I realised the Buddha is a living image in my experience, and not just a living image as a fictional image. The Buddha is there as a kind of living presence. I feel the Buddha in my life. I all too often forget, but he's there and he comes back fairly rapidly throughout the day. Not that I'm consciously thinking Buddha, 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 but his presence, the feeling of the Buddha, is there with me. So how to imagine a Buddha? Well, how did I come to imagine a Buddha? When I was 20, I was at the end of my degree at university, and I began to rethink about religion. I was brought up as a Christian, and I rejected that. I always say in India, I would lift the phone to ring, and there was no answer on the other end. But yes, I could no longer really believe in the God that was taught to me in my upbringing, and so I rejected it. But at a certain point, I woke up to the fact that there was more to religion than Christianity, and the structure of religion that went with it. I assumed the religion was about relating to a God, and a kind of absolute difference between humanity and God. But I woke up to the fact that I didn't really know anything about other religions. At that time, all those years ago, people knew much less. There was much less present. It was a much more of a monoculture at that time, old white British culture, and I was brought up very much within that. But so I there wasn't anything to present other religions to me. Judaism, yes, but very distantly and a little mysteriously from my point of view. So I one night after a smoke-filled evening, I went out and I bought all the scriptures of the main traditions, and I sort of went through them. I couldn't really connect with any of them. Some of them I found really fascinating, but they didn't speak to me. And I then picked up a book by Edward Conzer, a Penguin book called Buddhist Scriptures by Edward Conzer, which is a compilation from various different sources. It's a very, very good little collection. He's a famous scholar who was well known to our teacher, Urgyen Sangharakshita. Anyway, the first part is an account of the Buddha's past lives. I took that rather as nice stories. The second part is a life of the Buddha, a kind of biography of the Buddha by a very important Buddhist poet, Asvaghosha. In fact, he's the first dramatist in India, first Sanskrit dramatist. And he wrote a book called the Buddha Charita, The Acts of the Buddha. And it's It's not an attempt at a historical biography, but it recounts the traditional stories about the Buddha, the four sights, and so on and so forth. And some of the Buddha's teachings are there, quoted actually from the scriptures. And as soon as I started reading this, I felt this is what I've been seeking. This is what I've been looking for. And the image of the Buddha immediately came to life for me. I could see him wandering the dusty roads of India. I could see him communicating with his disciples. I could see him sitting under the Bodhi tree, and so on. It came at me very strongly in a way that's a little bit mysterious. And I'll try to come back to that a bit later if I remember, because there's something about the way in which the Buddha came alive for me that I think is quite significant and may help to answer this question of how to imagine a Buddha. So let's say this question is being asked by somebody who wants to imagine the Buddha, maybe has begun to be a Buddhist or begun to relate to Buddhism, begun to think that they might be a Buddhist, and wants to know how to relate to the Buddha. And so how could I recommend that you did it, if it's a question for you? And it's a very important question, how do you relate to the Buddha? Not just because one is a Buddhist and therefore wants to know the founder of the tradition, but because it's really important for us all to have ideals, to have an ideal figure in our lives. And you can see so much of modern culture is a sort of striving after those ideals, but often in either comic book form. I think this is what the Marvel films are about, none of which I've seen. I think I know what they're about. But the sort of general, I used to read the Marvel comics many years ago, Superman and all that. But what they're obviously about is sort of trying to find an ideal human being who is out to save other human beings. And in many ways, it's quite admirable, some of the figures that are drawn. Like Superman, he saves, he plunges in whenever he's needed to help beings, which is a very bodhisattva in our Buddhist language, like function. So it's very important that we do have an ideal of human existence, an ideal human being who we can look to as a guiding principle, as something we aspire to, something we measure our own lives against, and we try to raise our lives up to. Without that, where are we going? And what we end up doing is simply being interested in the lives of film stars who may be very good actors and may portray very great parts, but are often thoroughly ordinary and not very admirable human beings. Not always, but sometimes. Or musicians, or the latest, what are these programs called? The Britain's Got Talent and things like that. I'm so ignorant of that side of culture. I'm really out of date. I cut out of culture with the early Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd. I was there with Syd Barrett. But anyway, but these are all sort of efforts to find something to sort of look up to. And they're all really not very adequate. So when we're looking to imagine the Buddha, what we're really trying to do is find an ideal human being who we can guide our lives by, and we can aspire that our lives become like that. And without that ideal figure, it's very difficult to become more than you really are now. It's very difficult indeed. So it's a crucial question. I think our modern culture is bereft certainly of really lofty ideal images of a human being. Yes, we have some very great human beings who we do look to. Martin Luther King, Dr. Ambedkar in India. We have people who really did give their lives to help people who are oppressed and suffering and so on. But still there's something more that is required, a deeper dimension understanding and realization, a greater, even greater and more universal compassion, and so on. So imagining the Buddha is of great importance for us individually, but I think it's importance for our whole culture. So how do we start? Well, in Buddhist tradition, we can imagine the Buddha or relate to the Buddha on 3 different levels. I'm not going to go into the technical terms and so forth for this. Those of you who know them will immediately recognize. But almost always for us, and especially for us today, we're going to start with a more historical, factual level. The Buddha as a real human being. In our threefold puja, we say, the Buddha was born as we are born. He's not some supernatural being. He's the same as us. He walked this earth the same as us. He died from dysentery. It's a common experience for people like me in India. But he suffered ordinary human ailments, and he got weary, and so on. He was a real human being. That's the first level of the Buddha, of knowing the Buddha. So if you want to imagine the Buddha, the first thing to do is to hear his story. The Buddha Charita in that Buddhist Scriptures is a good way in. If you can, read the Buddhist Scriptures, the Pali Scriptures, that is the earliest Scriptures, which are arguably close to being records of his life and teaching. They're a bit stiff, the form of the translation is a bit stiff, but especially if you have a skilled interpreter or translator, they can really come to life. Our own teacher was a brilliant translator, and if you did a seminar with him on a text which was about the life and teaching of the Buddha, you'd sort of be there with the Buddha. He brought it to life so skillfully. Somebody interestingly said his way of approaching the Buddhist Scriptures was more like a literary critic than a scholar, a Buddhologist. He wasn't sort of interested just in the philology and the history and so forth. He was interested in getting inside the story and seeing it come to life. And I think my imagination of the Buddha came greatly through him. You'll find that in some of Sangharakshita's books. They draw this out. They bring the Buddha into relationship with you. You begin to feel you're there. I remember that sometimes in the seminars. I'd feel I was part of that group of monks and nuns sitting around the Buddha, listening to the Buddha, even raising questions and so forth with the Buddha, and feeling the extraordinary peace that flowed from him, that is often commented on in the Scriptures. Just to be with him was to be at peace. So that's the first way you can relate to the Buddha. Find out about him, about his life, and begin to imagine what it would have been like. India today is, of course, very, very different, but quite often you can get glimpses of what it must have been like. The great jungle, the Mahavana, which the whole of North India, probably the whole of India, was just a big jungle with clearings where people would establish agriculture and so forth, and Ganges basin where there would be a lot of agriculture, but also trade, and of course the same in South India. So the Buddha wandered in that environment, a very simple, sort of clean, basic culture, which was remarkably civilized. What you see in the Buddhist Scriptures is the interactions between people are very, very civilized. They always use very polite terms for each other. They're very courteous. Their way of greeting and so forth is very pleasantly ceremonious. So you try to get inside that world as best you can through the Scriptures, through the descriptions of the Buddha's life, through skilled expositors. And I think another basic step that helps to imagine the Buddha is to start bowing. I remember that the moment when I allowed myself to bow to the Buddha image. Because when you bow, there is in your mind something you're bowing to, even if you're not that conscious of it. Of course, there's a Buddha image, but that Buddha image is merely the representation of something that when you come to bow with more and more feeling, is really begins to be alive. So, yes, bowing to the Buddha can be a very early step in coming to imagine the Buddha. Then, if you can, if you've got the time and the inclination and so forth, go on pilgrimage. I'm sure Gautama will be able to advise you on where to go and what to see. But go to the sites where the Buddha, big events took place in the life of the Buddha. You can go to the place where he was born, Lumbini, which is over the border in Nepal. You can go to Bodh Gaya, where he gained enlightenment. You could go to Saranath, where he did his first teaching. You can go to Kushinagara, where he died. And these sites are rather remarkable. Bodh Gaya, for instance, it's a horrible town. I really dislike Bodh Gaya as a town. It's dirty. It's full of people preying upon tourists. You can't blame them, because tourists have got a lot of money and the people don't have much. But still, it makes a very unpleasant sort of atmosphere. I really don't like the town of Bodh Gaya. That's my personal feeling. You may have a different one. But then you go into the temple, the Mahabodhi temple, which it was built in the possibly 3rd century BC, the earliest part of it, and it may even have been very shortly before the Buddha's own life, and where a grandchild of the tree under which the Buddha sat exists. In fact, actually, genetically, it's the same tree. But because it was taken from cuttings, so that the tree that grew was the same tree. I'm not much of a botanist, but I think that's right. You seem to be agreeing with me. So you can go there and you can sit just within your nose, just a few feet from the spot that is pretty definitely where the Buddha sat when he gained enlightenment. And whenever I go to Bodh Gaya, I'd get my nose as close to the railings that surround that spot as I can and just gaze at that spot. It's now got an Ashokan sort of slab on it from the 3rd century before the Common Era. But, as far as we know, it's there that he sat, and the most important event in human history from our Buddhist point of view took place. And if you go there and you can sort of allow all the ruckus around you to fade away, it's a Hindu holy site, and sometimes that's a bit raucous. I remember occasions when there was an official Chinese party there doing a huge puja, but with very loud loudspeakers, which were up to the point at which the sound was breaking. And the tune sounded to me like a sort of Chinese version of a country and western song. Rather nice one, actually, but it wasn't exactly conducive to the sort of mood. No doubt it was very significant to those who were doing it. In fact, it was a very ancient puja, apparently. But I remember just sitting there with my nose up against the railings, looking at this spot where the Buddha apparently, and fully accept that it happened, gained enlightenment. And just suddenly it dawned on me, it really happened. It really happened there. Somebody, for the first time in the historical period, saw through the illusion of the conditioned existence, saw the sight of freedom, and not only saw it, but rested in it, came to inhabit it, as it were, came to base himself in it. It really happened there. I remember another occasion I was leading study in Delhi on the Satipatthana Sutta. It's a very important sutta in which the Buddha teaches about mindfulness. It's a sort of text for mindfulness. You know, all the mindfulness that's taught everywhere really can be traced back to the Satipatthana Sutta. And I was leading the study in North Delhi, and somebody told me, did you know that the site where the Buddha preached the Satipatthana Sutta is known? It's in South Delhi. Anybody been to Delhi? You remember the Baha'i temple, the Lotus Temple? It's extremely beautiful. It's quite near there. And you go into a shoddy little park in the middle of a sort of a middle-class area of tower blocks, rather shabby ones, and go into this slightly shabby, neglected park, and there on a rock is a little concrete roof, under which is an Ashokan inscription, saying that this is the place where the Buddha preached the Satipatthana Sutta. When I went there, the temperature was 48 degrees. Maybe I'm exaggerating, 47. And so we went up to the rocks, and you literally, even with shoes on, couldn't walk on them. And so we managed to get under the shade, and we read the sutra through. And just in doing that, I was there with the Buddha, with the Kurus of the Kurukshetra, listening to this remarkable teaching, which is so deep and yet so simple. So go to the places where the Buddha taught, where he lived. Go to Kushinagara. We have the place where he died. There's a little temple there. There's a stupa. And there's the place where his body was burned. That was very, very evocative. A huge brick stupa which is gradually decaying, but there's a very, very strong atmosphere there. And all of these help you to see the Buddha not just as an abstract figure from the past, as it were, but as a living presence. It becomes a living presence in your life. So if you want to imagine the Buddha, these are things you can do. You can read about him, you can read his teachings, and listen to his teachings as if he's speaking them. We do that very naturally. If people do read novels these days, I think they do still. But you know, when you read a novel, you populate the novel. If the novel is at all well written, it's full of real characters, and they have a life without you making any effort. Just by reading the novelist's description, the person comes to life and lives for a while in your imagination. I'm particularly struck by this with Dickens, who's got one of the most fertile imaginations you could possibly have in the field of the novel. It's just so many different characters, so many of them really odd and so on. But each of those characters, when you engage with them, comes to life. You're there with Oliver Twist when he asks for more, and my favourite with, what's his name? Oh dear, in Great Expectations, David Mitchell, quickly. Pip, in Great Expectations, when Magwitch comes from behind the grave. You see it all. And that's why it's rather spoiled when you see the television version of it, but because it's never quite how you imagine it. We quite naturally imagine real characters. So the Buddha will gradually come alive in your imagination, just through you making some effort to connect with him on the ordinary human level. And it's important to do that, because through realizing that the Buddha exists on the ordinary human level, you realize you can do what he did. He wasn't a special person. I mean, obviously was an extremely gifted individual of unusual qualities, but those qualities were human qualities. They weren't divine qualities, if you see what I mean. He wasn't an emanation of some divine presence. He wasn't an avatar. He was a human being like you. Cut him, he bled. And you could connect with him in that way, on that level, which is an extremely important basis. But as you begin to, the Buddha begins to come alive in your imagination, you can begin to relate to that imaginative Buddha, a Buddha of imagination. This takes us to the second level of traditional Buddhist approaches to the Buddha. So the Buddha becomes a Buddha not merely as the image of a historical figure, he becomes an ideal visionary form. Ideal so that he's shorn of the fleshly elements of him, and you see a deeper representation of his qualities. Often imagination gives us greater truth than ordinary fact, if you see what I mean. When you really see into somebody, you see something sort of more than the ordinary person. You know, sometimes people with that sort of visionary faculty can see in the people they know a kind of another presence, something bigger than what they appear in the ordinary, to the ordinary physical eye. You can begin to see them from another perspective. Of course, in the English tradition, there's many brilliant examples of this with the poet and painter and printer William Blake. You go to see his work in the Tate. You can see he's got, you know, the ghost of Nelson, which means the idealized form, which takes us to the qualities that he represented, and so on. So we naturally begin to idealize. We take that which we admire onto another level and see it in idealized form. Of course, this is an idealized representation of the Buddha. He wasn't golden. He probably didn't have a spike on the top of his head, although the scriptures tell you he did, but we know that's a later interpolation, etc. And of course he wasn't a sort of Greek figure, but we naturally begin to idealize that which we admire. We embellish that which we admire, and it begins to live in our imaginations beyond the merely historical. Of course, initially, that imagining of the Buddha, which you can do quite systematically, we do meditation practices in which we imagine systematically the Buddha in idealized form, and also in his different qualities, each represented by different figures. But they're all really qualities of enlightenment itself. Qualities of the Buddha, of a Buddha, of any Buddha. Wisdom, compassion, liberated energy, deep kindness, and so forth. So we imagine the Buddha in those sort of forms. We do this quite systematically. And we come into a kind of relationship with the Buddha in those sort of ways by a kind of exchange taking place, an exchange of energy, you could say. You know, when you're with anybody, whether you like it or not, there's an exchange of energy. So that when we're all exchanging energy together here, maybe to some extent mediated by our focus on imagining the Buddha, so that we come into a kind of energetic relationship with each other around that. When you just have a conversation with somebody, I'm talking a lot to a lot of people over these few days, and I'm very aware that when I'm with somebody, they're sort of, I was going to say moulding my energy. It's not that, but their energy affects my energy. They sort of come into me, and probably I go into them. You should be very aware of that going to see our teacher, Sangharakshita. I'd come out sort of lifted up a bit to his level, a little bit. After a while, I'd go around thinking I was that level and then realise I wasn't. But that's what you do in this sort of visualisation of the Buddha, of coming to know the Buddha. You come into a relationship with the ideal Buddha, and you thereby sort of pick up the Buddha's qualities. They become a little bit part of you. They affect you. The Buddha himself said, what we dwell upon, what we think of, that we become. This is a very important principle for imagining the Buddha. If you think of the Buddha, if you imagine the Buddha, you become a little bit Buddha-like, at least for a while. And the more you focus on the Buddha, the more Buddha-like you will become. So, yes, you can, without having these formal practices, you can sort of dwell upon the image of the Buddha that you carry in your own mind. And you will have one. I can guarantee it. If you come to any kind of knowledge about the Buddha, his life, his teaching and so forth, there will be an image in your mind. And it may not be very conscious, but you can make that more conscious and deepen your relationship with it. So that's the second level, although there's a little bit more to say about that, which I'll try to get to. There's a third level, which is, in a sense, the most mysterious and the most difficult and the most important. The Buddha himself said, you don't know me by knowing what I look like. Those who know me by my form don't know me. You only know me through the Dharma. What he meant by the Dharma was not the teaching, the eightfold this and the fivefold that and the fourfold that, although those are his teachings. He meant the reality that he realized. When the Buddha gained enlightenment, he saw things as they really are. He saw the fundamental principle out of which everything emerges. He saw it directly. He saw to such an extent that you could say he became that principle. It's where he came from. It's where he operated from. It's where he taught from. But it's the Dharma as a kind of force, almost, you might say. The root of Dharma is dru, which means to that which supports, that which upholds. So it's the moral and spiritual principles, the metaphysical principles, which uphold everything. And it's that the Buddha ultimately realized, that he spoke of himself as serving, as revering and honoring and serving. He lived his life from that moment serving the Dharma and living to communicate it to others. So he said, that's the real me. If you really want to know the Buddha, you must know the Dharma that makes him the Buddha. And of course, when he dies, he ceases to have a physical form, and what he becomes is the Dharma. So that takes us to another level altogether. That's the element that is most difficult for us to develop, and we have to spend a lot of time working on ourselves, following a system of practice that will help us to get to the point where the Dharma is not just a set of teachings, but it is a reality which is the basis for our experience. And that's what we're doing as Buddhists. We're trying to get to the point where we realize the Buddha as he truly is, as the Dharma. So this takes me back to my original encounter with the Buddha. I described my own experience of reading the Buddhist Scriptures and immediately recognizing something, and an image coming to life immediately for me through that encounter with the words that express the Buddha's life and his teaching. And there's something that I've come to reflect on in that experience of the encounter. And here I'm going to try to express something that I haven't entirely thought through properly. So please forgive me. There's a feeble way of getting out of it, isn't it? But let me try anyway. When the Buddha gained enlightenment, it wasn't just a personal event. It wasn't even an event in the lives of those he encountered. It was a cosmic event. That is the way it's seen in Buddhist tradition. When the Buddha gained enlightenment, in tradition, of course, in a mythic way, says the whole universe shook. That's a way of saying that what happened changed everything. When the Buddha gained enlightenment, everything changed, because suddenly there was the highest dimension brought into lived reality. And that was not just, as I say, a historical event which has gone and passed, that affected those who were immediately touched by him and then has affected us sort of indirectly. It was something that, in another sense, continually occurs. It's continually happening. The Buddha's own realization of reality is still happening. And it means that the Buddha is still accessible to us. I told you this is going to be a bit weird and a bit difficult, but the Buddha is still accessible to us. And he's accessible to us in imaginative form. So in Buddhist tradition it's said there are sort of two aspects, two sides to this imaginative experience of the Buddha. One side is what our own imaginations create. I picture to myself, out of my own experience and imaginative resources, I picture to myself the Buddha. That's a necessary and an important process. But that isn't really the Buddha. That's my imagination of the Buddha. It's a good start. It's a necessary start. But if you do that, we're taught, if you continue to imagine the Buddha and you do it more and more sort of with greater and greater feeling, entering more and more strongly into it, and more understanding of the teachings that the Buddha embodies, a point comes when, as it were, the Buddha sort of inhabits the figure. Such difficult language, isn't it? Because it's not to be taken literally. It's as if at a certain point it's no longer merely your imagination of the Buddha out of your own imaginative resources. It is the Buddha. You are actually in contact with the Buddha. Because the Buddha is, as it were, eternally enlightening. He's eternally teaching. This is, of course, to be understood in another way. It's not to be understood in a literal, historical, factual way. It's a way of trying to express something about the nature of reality that cannot be expressed in ordinary, as it were, scientific terms. We'll have more to say about that tomorrow night. But ordinary scientific terms only takes us so far in understanding the Buddha. We have to resort to a dimension of our being, a faculty that we have for recognizing higher truth, recognizing truths beyond the ordinary logical factual truths, and which is what we have to awaken, what we're trying to awaken through our meditation and so on. Some of us have it very much awake, some of us have to struggle to awaken it. But I'm talking the language of that faculty. I'm not talking the language of a history and scientific fact. I'm talking, in a way, a deeper reality. And in that deeper reality, the Buddha is always gaining enlightenment, is always enlightened, is always teaching, is always relating to us. And when we make the effort to imagine the Buddha and reach up to the Buddha responds. And suddenly your imaginative picture is animated by something that is true, is real. It's not that suddenly, Clark Kent and Superman, I don't know why that one's in my mind, the Buddha takes off his Clark Gable kit and suddenly the Superman stands forth. It's not like that. Same image. It's just that the image is imbued with reality, imbued with the deepest truth. And that truth speaks directly to you and raises you up, as it were, to its level, to his level. Much better to think of that truth in embodied terms as a human, because if we think of it as an impersonal, we necessarily think of it like gravity or something like that. We think of it as something dead and flat. But so if we think of of reality as ultimately the Buddha in the sense of the reality that he realized, we get closer to what it is. What it is beyond that. It's beyond words altogether, beyond our ordinary understanding. So, I hope that all means something to you. It gets a bit weird towards the end, but necessarily, because reality is really weird. It is not what we think it is, even in purely scientific terms. It's not what we think it is, but it's so much more than we think it is, so much more than we can know with our ordinary intellects. And we get there by developing a relationship with the Buddha, by developing an emotional relationship, as I say. Bowing is a way to cultivate that. And doing puja and so forth, accompanied by study of what the Buddha taught, the way the Buddha understood things. You have to have both, because as it were, the devotional without the understanding is blind faith. But the understanding without the emotional is just dry academic knowledge. You have to have both. So if you work to develop a connection with the Buddha, as first of all as a historical human being, and recognizing the majesty of what he achieved, the magnitude of what he achieved. Majesty is not a bad word there. And the grandeur of what he achieved as a human being, and realize it's related to you. You can do it. It's not different from you. Yes, he had special gifts, according to Buddhist tradition, because he'd been developing them over many lives. But yes, he was not in form, as it were, different from you. So you can develop that relationship with the Buddha in that way. And if you do that, gradually an imaginative Buddha will emerge in your mind. You'll find it's there without you really realizing it's there. And if you begin to cultivate that, focus on that, particularly if you use the developed forms that we have for doing that, gradually a point comes when the image is, as it were, imbued with reality. It ceases to be merely your image. It becomes something more than your image. And it becomes imbued, of course, with the Buddha as he truly is, that is, as the Dharma. So I hope that's a bit of an answer to the question of how we imagine a Buddha. I sort of taken it more like how we imagine the Buddha. But imagining the Buddha is imagining any old Buddha, any Buddha, a Buddha, in a sense, because they all are ultimately to be understood in terms of the Dharma. They're not different. Yes, they may manifest in different forms, in different ways. Like our Buddha was, according to tradition, a sort of intellectual Buddha. He was an analyst, a Vibhajavadin, a one who analysed. The next Buddha, according to tradition, who's supposed to be coming, Maitreya, is a feeling Buddha. He's a loving Buddha. Maitreya means the loving one, the kindly one, like Maitreya Raja. And so each Buddha does have a sort of character, but as a human manifestation, as a manifestation in time and space, because time and space is always specific. You can't have a generality within time and space. So you've got to be this, not that. But nonetheless, they all are, in their ultimate nature, the Dharma. So maybe that's helpful. Maybe it's not. If it is, come back tomorrow and we'll talk a bit more about the Dharma that the Buddha realized. I didn't know I was going to do that, but I suppose I probably am. the Dharma that the Buddha realized. We're going to talk about how to practice the Dhamma, or the significance of the Dhamma in a secular humanist civilization or culture. How do we bring that to bear? What does it mean? And in the meantime, stay for a puja. There's a full moon puja. Traditionally, the full moon is a time of high energy, if you like. Even scientifically it is, isn't it? The moon's pull is at its highest, but it was traditionally supposed to be a very beneficial time to practice, because worldly circumstances can support your efforts. Ultimately, your efforts go beyond that, but full moon is supposed to be a very, very good time to do a puja, and you have that opportunity now to imagine the Buddha, and to imagine the Buddha by worshipping the Buddha and by coming into a relationship with the Buddha, worshipping him, saluting him, going for refuge to him, confessing to him, rejoicing in the merits of all who've achieved fine spiritual qualities, and then asking the Buddha for teachings. And then anything that you've gained from that, any positive merit, as we say, you gain from that, you dedicate to all beings. So, yes, test yourselves. Test me rather. Does what I've been talking about have meaning in the context of doing the puja? So thank you very much.